could we be given warning at the beginning of a programme if there's going to be anything about the Beatles, as all Beatle fans can make sure to listen, and have a chance to ring up other fans to make sure they are also listening.
Hi everybody, this is John here. This is Paul, George,
and Ringo.
And we're very happy to be on your program once again.
Welcome to another Beatles News Brief podcast. I'm your Beatles news guy, Steve Marinucci, the founder in 1995 of Abbey Road's Beatle page, the first working Beatle news site on the internet. Today we have a very interesting show for you, a theme show about the Beatles in Canada. We'll first talk with John Brower, the co-promoter of the Toronto Rock and Roll Revival Music Festival, which in 1969 featured John Lennon, Yoko Ono, and the Plastic Ono Band, and whose performance was immortalized on the Live Peace in Toronto album. The festival was also the subject of the recent movie Revival 69, the concert that rocked the world. You'll also hear how John Lennon got added to the bill, and then almost didn't get there, not once but twice. And we'll chat with Piers Hemmingsen, the foremost authority on the history of Canada and the Beatles. We'll have all that and much more, so sit back and enjoy. First, here's John Brower, who is a delight to talk to about the Toronto Rock and Roll Revival concert he promoted in 1969 that featured John and Yoko. He also tells some great stories from the concert about some of the other performers, including Jim Morrison of the Doors, Little Richard, Gene Vincent, and Alice Cooper. And he also talks about Geddy Lee of Rush. You didn't know he was connected with the concert? Well, he is, and you'll find out how. So here's John Brower. We're on the phone with John Brower. You were one of the co-promoters of the Toronto Rock and Roll Festival, correct?
That is correct.
Did you also have any direct involvement with the movie festival, or is that somebody else that did that?
No, it's Ron Chapman and Green Siren Pictures, Trish Dolman, producers. Her company's in Vancouver, Ron's based in Toronto. Of course, it's based on my story. I signed over the story rights for the documentary. And as you know from watching the film, I pretty much narrate it.
You and Ken had done a number of shows before the Rock and Roll Revival, is that correct?
Yes, we did a very big pop festival in June 21 and 22 for 2 days with 25,000 people each day, headlined by the band, Sly and the Family Stone, Steppenwolf, Johnny Winter, Chuck Berry, just a whole list of some of the best bands of the day.
Yeah, that's mentioned in the movie. John and Yoko, am I right to say that John and Yoko were not in your original plans for this thing?
No, they were not. They were a Hail Mary at the suggestion of Tim Fowler.
That was amazing, and even according to the movie, even after John and Yoko entered the picture, it wasn't really certain you were able to get them, correct?
Well, no. At the last minute, John got cold feet until he found out Eric Clapton was on the way or at the airport.
Mm-hmm. In the film, it's indicated that, and I think actually you used these words at some point where you said they were going to be MCs, which kind of indicates that they weren't going to perform. Was that right? Were they actually?
Well, when I invited them to come, I invited them to be the MCs, and John said we wouldn't want to come unless we could play. And I said, "You mean the Beatles?" And he said, "No, me and Yoko, and we'll put a little band together."
Ah, okay, that makes sense. And you said, and you said, I'm actually getting a little ahead because down at the end of the film you said the whole thing came together because of unforeseen circumstances. So it was really amazing that it even happened at all.
Yes, because if John and Yoko or John had not said that and declined, then the investors would not have gone forward with the balance of monies required to make the show happen.
Okay.
One of the investors was in the office with me when I spoke to John on the speakerphone, and consequently it was like, okay, all right, yes, we'll put up the rest of the money.
And you still have all those tape recordings, don't you?
No, I have no tape recordings.
Oh,
the
because
tape
Go ahead.
recordings that are in the movie, Many of them came from Richie York's estate, the journalist, and the others came from the BBC archives. And they were sourced there by Piers Hemmingsen, who has written the book, The Beatles in Canada, Volume 1,
Oh,
Volume 2 is
yes.
coming out.
I know Piers.
Okay, so Piers sourced them and made Ron Chapman, the director, aware that they were there.
Ah, okay. Okay, interesting. At one point in the movie, John or Klaus Foreman said that John had never been frontman before. Do you agree
Yes,
with that? Do you
I
agree
do
with?
agree with that because I think that, especially listening to the live tape of the Beatles August 17th, 1965 at Maple Leaf Gardens,
Hmm.
Paul does almost all the talking, all the chatter, introduces the songs. John introduces one song, and it seemed that Paul was, the de facto front person for that band.
Okay. There's footage from the festival that's previously unseen. Is that correct?
A lot of it.
A lot of it. Where did that come from?
It came from Iron Mountain, where Pennybaker had put it when he pretty much wrapped up and discussed the fact that, Alan Klein told him that we're not going to give you any permission to do anything. And then only years later, after John had passed, did Yoko agree to let him put together some kind of a, I can't even describe it. It was horrible, Sweet Toronto. And it had nobody in it of any consequence other than the performers just playing a few songs. It wasn't a movie. It was like a home movie.
But then
So
they've had
Ron Chapman discovered mini cameras there that Kodak had given Pennybaker that hadn't even been processed yet. Film that had been sitting up there unprocessed since 1969.
wow. But Robbie Krieger says that the Doors did not get filmed.
They did not get filmed, and apparently Jim did not want to be filmed. Jim was not the Lizard King in 1969 that he was when I brought him to Toronto for the first time in 1968, April 20th. I kind of like to think we started 420, but that might be a stretch. Then the girls were screaming and fainting. I mean, he was the Lizard King. When he came in 1969, a year later, he'd been arrested in Miami. He was facing felony charges. He was a very, very diminished performer, even though his performance was stellar, incredible. But he had his back to the audience the whole time. It was dark. It was at night, late at night. And he started the show with the end, which was the first time and only time they ever did that. Robbie made a point of acknowledging that. And the compliment that he gave to the other performers in the beginning was just magical. It was like, that's almost my favorite part of the movie is what Jim said. Because I had a kind of a very unique relationship with him, very, very briefly. But when I had to pick the Doors up, I was in '68. I was told to have 2 limos and 6 beers. 1 limo for Jim with the beers, and the band and the manager jumped in the limo and drove off. And Jim and I were standing at the curb, and we got in the limo, and he saw the beers in the opener and had a beer, drained it. And then he had another one. He moved his shoulder at me, like meaning, like have one. And I nursed mine down to the hotel. When we got to the hotel, the limo driver got out, opened the door, and Jim stepped out and turned around, looked at me. He goes, "Hey, man, thanks for not talking." I was too terrified to say a word in the car, so we sat in silence for 40 minutes. Robbie told me later that's the best thing you could have done with Jim.
That's a great story.
So the next day, of course, after selling out the show, the agent called me and he said, "You did a great job, kid," because I was 21 then. He said, and Jim told me he likes the promoter.
That's great. That's great. How did you find out Geddy Lee was there?
Well, I didn't find out, but Ron Chapman is a friend of Geddy Lee.
Oh, okay.
Ron, the director, has known Geddy personally for years.
Oh, I see. Okay. I didn't catch how he got connected to the movie, and I thought that was really interesting that he was there and he did the interviews. What did you think of Yoko before you met her? Had you heard any of her music before that?
I must tell you, no. I had no opinion of Yoko. I was not somebody that hated Yoko because I wasn't trying to be in love with John.
Mhm.
A lot of girls and everything in England or whatever, fans were mortified that John, the last of the available Beatles, was gone now. Um, she was quite interesting. She stayed at Ronnie Hawkins' house with John when we brought them back in December to announce the Toronto Peace Festival and take them in a private railway train down to Ottawa to meet the Prime Minister Trudeau, the father of the current Prime Minister. She was very bright and very interesting. She was a woman that was not afraid to speak up and be a voice in the room. And I think
Right.
that was very early Gloria Steinem kind of the way women should feel, and that they should feel comfortable to participate in conversations. And John gave her, an unlimited opportunity to do that by being very comfortable and proud of her.
Right. Right. What did you think of her? What did you think of her set at the show?
Well, it was insane. I mean, it was like something from another planet. It was, I'm surprised aliens didn't show up because it sounded like she might have been summoning them. In fact, there were a couple of people that did say they had an alien experience outside after the show. One of them is one of my oldest friends, and another one wrote a book about it. He lives in Ireland, and he wrote a book about being abducted after the show.
Oh my
So
gosh.
I don't know. I have no idea. But it was something that was performance art, and it was done passionately. That's the one thing you see. Yoko was in her own world. She was there, and the smile on her face afterwards that she had done this. John had given her the freedom to do it, although at a certain point he tried to pull the plug, and he was saying to her, "Okay, baby, that's enough." I mean, it went on for 17 minutes, so
Right.
that's a long time. But
Right.
it was a beautiful experience, to watch the two of them. And as shocking as it was, that's how powerful it was. And that's what John wanted. I think he wanted to be powerful on their own. And if they did something that had never been seen before, well, more power to them.
Yeah, Klaus Warman talks about that in the film, and that's that's really kind of interesting the way he transformed himself into understanding what was happening. Did all of the John Lennon Yoko set get released? Is there anything that we haven't heard?
To my knowledge, no. I'm sure both of the sides were the complete performances by the band and by side 2 or side B with Yoko. No, there's no hidden tracks.
Okay. There've been DVDs and stuff of their performance. In fact, as I recall, the music mix on the DVD is different than on the album. I think it's a little rougher than on the album they put out. But okay. There was a similar show, I'm sure you know about it, in London in 1972 with all the oldies performers, with Little Richard, with Jerry Lee, with Bo Diddley, and also Bill Haley. Did you have anything to do with that?
No,
At
and
Wembley?
I did not. I did not. To the best of my knowledge,
Mhm.
the Toronto Rock and Roll Revival was the first time that all of those performers ever performed together on the same stage.
Mhm. Okay.
And as you well know, an agent that was up there representing one of the bands.
Right.
Can't remember his last name. Richard.
Are you talking about Shep
No,
Gordon?
no. Shep was a good friend of ours. That's why
Okay.
Alice was at the show. Richard Nader. And
Oh,
Richard
okay.
Nader immediately went back to New York and put on Richard Nader's Rock and Roll Revival and made a career for himself out of the Rock and Roll Revival. Sold out Madison Square Garden like every year. God bless him. I met him, and
Right.
we became friends later. I was very flattered by the fact that he did that and that it was hugely successful.
Mhm. And the film says that you guys really launched Alice Cooper, which is really
Well,
kind of. Do you see it? Do you agree with that?
Well, yes, I do agree with it. And it also falls under the category of a few fortuitous circumstances. Okay. If Alice Cooper had not been backing up Gene Vincent, they would have played in the early part of the show, late morning or early afternoon. But Gene Vincent insisted on playing at night with the lights on. So he got to come on before Little Richard. Chuck Berry was happy to play any time of the day. Just get me some good musicians and give me my money in cash.
Mhm.
So as you saw in Chuck's set, the sun was just going down as he finished.
Right.
So Alice Cooper now then gets to perform between Gene Vincent and Little Richard in the prime spot on the bill at night with the lights, which made a huge difference. And the fact that the chicken showed up as Shep confesses to bringing it, I think he took a little bit of artistic license by saying that there were feral chickens running up and down the street. That's not the case. But, he didn't want to bust himself too much. I love Shep. I've known him for years. That's why Alice was on the show, because they were our friends, and we needed to try to get Shep some money. And as I say in the movie, Shep never wanted to miss a trick. Said, well, can you pay us to back up Gene Vincent and pay us again to play? And we just laughed and said, of course. Because we were only paying them like $500 for each performance. But yes, it gave them a chance to be performing at night when the crowd was really getting built up, waiting for this magical John Lennon appearance. So they were ripe for Alice Cooper. They were ripe for Little Richard. Then they saw John Lennon, and then they waited, and then they got the Doors. I mean, it was an incredible evening of artists, from Chuck Berry to Gene Vincent to Alice to Little Richard to John and Yoko, Plastic Ono Band, and the Doors. I'd like to have that bill right now. I think I could probably sell out a 40-acre field.
I bet you could. I was telling you that I had found something today in my doing research. I found an interview that John did, and I'm not sure what paper this is from. I'm guessing maybe the Daily Mirror, and he talks about how he connected with you, and he said the whole thing was a laugh because I got the call at 9 o'clock on Friday night, left Saturday morning at 3 a.m., and before they'd even hung up, I had the group together. He said it was a fantastic bill. Little Richard, Chuck Berry, Gene Vincent, Bo Diddley, Jerry Lee Lewis, and the Doors, and Yoko did a number which was half rock and half madness, and it really freaked him out. After Yoko had been on for about a quarter of an hour, we all left our amps going like the clappers and had a smoke up on the stage. That's when they stepped and the whole crowd stopped, and the whole crowd was chanting, "Give peace a chance."
Yeah, I know. It was a magical moment for John because he, as he said, later he hadn't been so excited or had such a good time in his whole life, because here was an audience of over 20,000 people giving him acknowledgement that "Give Peace a Chance" meant so much to them that they wanted to sing along, and they were lighting the matches and lighters that Kim Fowley had requested. Now, Melanie had candles on stage at Woodstock. There was another band that asked people to light matches and lighters, but this was the first time that a performer had been welcomed to the stage with matches and lighters, and it was appropriate that it was for John Lennon to assuage his fear. He was always known to be nervous before going on stage, even back in the Cavern days and in Hamburg. So Kim Fowley, the movie should have been dedicated to Kim Fowley. Had I had any kind of control, I would have insisted that at the end, this movie is dedicated to the memory of Kim Fowley. Because, first of all, Kim Fowley suggested that when we were going to cancel the show, you must call John Lennon and invite him. And John went for it. Kim Fowley told me he won't be able to say no. He loves all these bands. And John went one step further and said, we want to play. And then the matches and lighters created a magic that night. And that's what inspired it to continue to this day, where it's a tradition with cell phones. It's that festival, that experience, that night.
Yeah, Kim Fowler was, that was the thing that I remember from, because when I got the album right after it came out. And I remember, him saying, "Give peace a chance, John," and the way he introduced them coming on stage was just really dynamic, and it really, it really was powerful. So I got to say about the film that it was not what I expected. I really liked the fact that you had all the background information. I was just expecting like you said about
the documentary that had been put together earlier. Just, a rehash of performers, but it's a lot more than that. And it's amazing that you guys got it going at all after all that craziness. I mean, that it happens. It's mind blowing that you got it done. Um,
Well, I credit Ron Chapman. I mean, he pulled off a miracle here because there were a lot of roadblocks along the way. There were a lot of challenges for him, and he resurrected footage that would have never seen the light of day, and assembled it into a magical movie. And I still say that Revival '69 is one of the great biker movies of all time.
talk about that, because I didn't even mention it. The bikers really had. I mean, Give Me Shelter. The Hells Angels played a big part in that, not in a good way, but in this case, it was a different story. They escorted John and Yoko into the area, into Toronto, from the airport, and
Well, they did, yes.
and that was really different than what happened with the Hells Angels and the Rolling Stones.
Well, the energy was John Lennon and Peace, and the energy at Altamont was the Rolling Stones, and a lot of drunkenness and a lot of stoned, and the Hells Angels being out in the crowd and everywhere. You notice in the movie that Edjo says, and John gave us our own section in the stadium. Well,
Right.
Yeah, I did, because I didn't want them mingling all over the place with people and feeling uncomfortable, or people feeling weird because they got 6 bikers sitting in front of them. No,
Right.
I gave them their own section of the stadium. And the other thing is, people have said, and I'll share this story with you. People have said, how was it possible that 100+ bikers were drinking and smoking dope and whatever in public right out at the airport? If that was happening now, why weren't they all arrested? How did that happen?
Right.
Well, our financial backers were the 2 young Eaton brothers of Eaton's in Canada department stores, which at that time the Eatons were as close to royalty in Canada as you could get. Eaton's were the largest retailers. Their catalog was $1 billion a year just in mail order. And the police were basically told, you know what, no matter what, hands off, just let this thing go down and get it over with.
Okay. Well, John, congratulations on the story being told, and it's a great movie. They did a good job, and your part in it is really nice. Is John Walker still alive? Ken Walker still alive?
No. That's another little funny story. Kenny's not with us. Neither is Thor Eaton. When Ron, like if you would see me now, well, I've had friends say to me, when they saw the movie, wow, you look rough in that movie. That was 7 years ago that interview with me was done.
Oh, really?
Because Ron was told in the beginning by Bell Media, who owns Crave, that if you don't get Brower on camera, you're not going to raise money for this movie because there's nobody left to tell the story. And if he dies, you don't have a movie. So he called me and said, you have to be so-and-so place tomorrow at 2 p.m. for 3 hours on camera. And I was partying pretty heavy with my buddies, doing drinking, smoking dope, hash. We're living the life. And I said, Ron, I need a few days to detox and clean up. Like, we've been on a 3-day bender here. And he goes, no, it's got to be tomorrow at 2 o'clock. So that's what it had to be. And, I looked rougher than a bear turd rolled in fish hooks in that movie. And I just had to roll with it because that was it. Either get me on film or nothing's going to happen.
Well, you did a great job, and so did Ron. It really is a good movie. Like I said, I was just expecting a rehash, and it's a lot more than that. You get to hear all those phone calls and everything like that, and all the quotes from John Lennon and stuff, and you even got Yoko. You even got Yoko in there.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Yoko, is a major part of everything to do with John from the time
Right.
we met. I'll tell you a funny little story. Siddons, the manager of the Doors, came to me on the stage when Jerry Lee Lewis was playing and said, listen, Jim and I need to talk to you and John Lennon. Can we do that? And I was saying, yeah. He didn't tell me why. So I get John out of the dressing room, and Bill Siddons goes, John, we would like you to close the show. And John was like mortified. He's like, what? John was nervous enough about playing. Now the Doors want him to close the show. They want to go on before him. Well, the Doors knew that the show was almost canceled if John had not come on board. So they were afraid that if John played before them, everybody would leave. So John was never told anything about that the show was going to be canceled if he didn't show up. No, that he probably went to his grave not even knowing that. So I'm standing there blindsided, and John is like stammering, like, you're the headliners. And Little Richard was close by, and Little Richard comes over and he goes, I will close the show the way it should be closed, by me, the king. You know that, Mr. Promoter. You know that, Mr. Lennon. You know that, Mr. Doors. And John Lennon and Jim Morrison were like drop-jawed because Little Richard was like spanking them. And he had been complaining about the piano earlier, wanted another one. So I said to him, Richard, thank you. That's a very kind offer, but you're on next. And by the way, that piano, it's my personal one. I had it brought here specially for you. And Bob Lefsetz goes, that was a lie, wasn't it? I go, yes, it was. I was very surprised. Lefsetz just barked at me like, that was a lie. Of course it was a lie, but it got Little Richard to feel better, and he walked away. But about 20 feet away, he went, I am the king, in a high mellifluous soprano. I said to John, why don't you go back in the dressing room? Everything's fine. And I told Jim, and I said to Bill Siddons, I said, look, if John Lennon, if you don't want to close the show, then you don't even have to play. I don't even care. This is about John Lennon. And John Lennon does not want to close the show. You're booked to close the show. So Siddons looked at Jim, and Jim says, okay, we'll close. And then he looked at me and goes, but we got to be on stage for John and Eric. And I was like, no problem, because they'd been on stage, watching Chuck Berry and watching other acts, but they wanted to make sure that when John came on, they got to be on stage, and they were, right. Of course.
Jerry Lee Lewis was another guy who, wasn't afraid to speak his mind. I know I saw firsthand one night when he almost hit a piano with a whiskey bottle because he didn't like it. Did any of the other performers give you that kind of a situation that Little Richard did? Or was everybody else?
Little Richard just complained about the piano and asked if we could get another one, and the answer was no. He wasn't threatening to not play or anything. Nobody complained about anything. I think it was such a beautiful day. The magic and the excitement of everybody knowing that John Lennon was on a plane, that it had left London, and it was going to land here, and he was going to be brought to the stadium. I don't think a lot of people realized that 80 motorcycles were going to escort him and drive into the stadium and park on the track near the north wall, because all these bikers, they weren't leaving their bikes out on the street. You know what I mean? I had to open the northwest gate, and bing, bang, boom, they came in, and that was it. That was the most incredible moment. I still get chills thinking about it when we came into the stadium. And I just all of a sudden realized, oh my God, he's here. We're in the stadium. He's going to play. It's happening.
If another film project came your way on this content, what would you want it to do, or would you even consider it?
The documentary was a Hail Mary because I had been pitching a script that I started writing in 2009 called variously over the years Pop 69 or Rock War Peace or John Lennon Ate My Lunch. And we are still now campaigning to have that made into a feature film. And what it does is it tells the story of myself, my wife, my friends, my partners, and all of the things going on in our world as young 20s, early 20s people dealing in this magical world of being the big rock promoters in a very big city and in 1969. And it's a really fun it's a kind of not a comedy, but it's a romantic comedy. There's, affairs going on and a little bit of, I won't spoil anybody's impression of it. But it's a fun movie, but it's also a beautiful movie. It's a very romantic film, and I have a representative now who is shopping that based on the fact that, the documentary has done so well and been received so well. And when people see it, they go, wow, yeah, there's a story about all of these people. Yeah, there is. And here's the script. So I am looking forward to the possibility of that getting action. But that is what we were shopping and working on when Ron Chapman, I haven't told you this either. I was having a New Year's Eve party at my apartment at the Thompson Hotel in Toronto. And a little after midnight, this is like 7 years ago, Ron shows up with another guy, and everybody's drunk. They're on mushrooms, they're smoking hash. And Ron comes in and starts yelling at me, literally, "You have to let me make this movie. You're not going to get this movie made. I told you that. I can get it made." And I was like, "Ron, okay, please." Like, I'm on mushrooms, right? I'm like, "Ron, please. Okay, if you just be quiet, I'll let you make the movie." And he came back the next morning and he got me to sign a one-page offer, that he could go out and shop this, and came back with a nice, attractive deal for me like a month later. And that was it. That's how that doc got made.
Congratulations and good luck on the other film. That would be nice. Like I said, what was really unique about this film was it's not just a rehash of the festival, it's the story behind it and all the interesting little tidbits that are in it that that people haven't seen.
Well, also the animation added enormously to it because you were able to put faces and characters behind these tapes that Piers Hemmingsen was aware of were in the BBC archives. And once Ron Chapman got to hear those, it gave him an entirely different opportunity to expand the interest level of the movie by creating scenes with animation that would never have been able to they would just be voices.
Right. Yeah. Piers has done some great work documenting
the
Beatles
work.
In Canada. Yeah. It really is.
We have a project currently now to get the tapes that he has that were the Beatles live August 17, 1965 at Maple Leaf Gardens. Doug McClement, the foremost sound engineer in the country, discovered that they were half track, not quarter track, and the sound is unbelievable. Bob Ezrin, we took him in. Bob and I went to high school together. Bob Ezrin came in to listen to him, and he just sat there. He said, "It's like being on stage with the Beatles."
Wow.
It's just literally like being on stage with the Beatles. So there was a big story written in Billboard about it, and then it was covered by the London Times. The Toronto Star did a full page, and tomorrow we are playing the tapes and the press conference for the woman, Karen Bliss, the writer, who broke the story in Billboard, and we're giving her the next level of how we want to take this out and keep it in Canada. In Canada, we're kind of under a little bit of pressure like Greenland and the Panama Canal, where Trump has got his eyes on us, and it's like a doe, in the headlights, or we don't know if this mountain lion is going to come out of the woods and kill us. So there's a lot of nationalism up here. So we're going to do a campaign that Karen's going to launch in the media around the world of keep the Beatles in Canada, keep these tapes here. Let's get a corporate sponsor. Let's get them donated to the National Music, Archive or whatever it is in Calgary, National Music Center, and the University of Toronto listening room, and keep them here. Let a corporate sponsor, Live Nation or Apple Music or somebody come in and buy them and put up the money, which is going to be used to print the second book and do reprints of the first book and market them properly. These books have never been marketed properly. God bless Piers, but he did everything he could to get that first book done, and then was lucky to get some distribution on it in England and, sold out here. But that book needs to be something that Canada celebrates, because the Beatles were here on the radio and in our stores for a year before they were in the U.S. And it's one of the great untold stories. So we're looking forward to that, the Beatles in Canada, Volume 2, and reprinting Volume 1. So
I've seen the first volume, not the second, and the first volume is just incredible.
Yeah, well,
It
the
really,
second one is incredible as well. I
I'm
was
sure it
chosen,
is.
honored to write one of the forewords. Richie York, who's not with us anymore, legendary journalist, he wrote the foreword as well. So the two of us are, him from up in the sky and me from down on the ground. They're very proud of that book and very anxious to see it get its due in the international awareness of the Beatles. And I think these tapes are going to make that happen. It's like a 360-degree situation where the tapes sell, they finance the books, and the books promote the Beatles again. So it just keeps going around in a cycle.
Hmm. Yeah, no, that sounds really good.
There's another wonderful Beatles book called Fashioning the Beatles by Deirdre Kelly, which is about to get its due as well. It's a brilliant book. It's been reviewed amazingly well everywhere. She's been in London with it. She's been in Japan with it. And it tells the story of how the Beatles' clothing influenced the look of each of the periods of time that they changed from one look to the next, to the next, to the next. I just finished it.
Is she Canadian also?
She's Canadian from Toronto. She's the editor of the York University paper. She's also been a celebrated journalist in Canada. And this book is marvelous because it's a story that's never been told. And it's fascinating. She spent years researching it, traveling to England, finding these clothing people that had made the suits, guys my age that were making the clothes for the Beatles, how the Beatles would find clothes, and Mary Quant and all these people, French people, Italian designers, American manufacturers, J.C. Penney, things like that would take these looks and translate them into mass market products, and they'd be sitting waiting for the next Beatles look and the next Beatles look. And who knew? Who knew any of this?
Right.
So
well,
Fashioning the Beatles by Deirdre Kelly. I really want to give a shout out to that.
Okay. One thing I was going to mention, and you mentioning her brought it back to my head. I loved the fact that you had comments from Richie York and Robert Christgau,
Yes.
two very respected rock writers who who influenced me in my career, and I was really glad to see both of them in there. Is Christgau still alive? I'm not sure. I'm not aware if he's...
Yes. I do believe he is, absolutely.
Okay.
I have yet to meet him.
I knew Richie York had passed, but I wasn't sure about Christgau. So that was nice to see them in there. Do you have anything else you want to comment on, John?
Oh, I'm pretty good at answering questions, but off the cuff, I'd have to start telling you stories of other events and all that. We'll get into another one sometime.
Yeah.
I did the 2-hour interview with Bob Lefsetz. If you listen to that, you might get some ideas for going off into a 1-hour story about some other event. John and I tried to do the Peace Festival. It was like, it was a brilliant idea, but, we were very naive, both of us. We had no idea the political machine that was going to chew us up and spit us out. And I struggled after that collapsed, but I managed to pull off Canada's Woodstock, the Strawberry Fields Festival in August of 1970, which to this day is considered one of the great festivals of all time. Because
who was on that? Who was on that? Who did you have
Led
on that?
Zeppelin, Grand Funk Railroad, of course, Alice Cooper were big stars by now. 10 years after, Melanie, just flying the Family Stone close to show Monday morning. It was 3 days in the woods, and yet you could drive around the track, the Grand Prix racetrack, and park your car, and then you could camp out at your car. And so unlike Woodstock, where people had to abandon their cars, walk for miles, there were over 8,000 cars towed at Woodstock. A nightmare. Never mind, you just survive Woodstock. This was 3 beautiful days and nights, and the bands played, and people had campfires at night and sing-alongs, and it was absolutely magical. So I was able to pull that off out of the phoenix, out of the fire of the Toronto Peace Festival. But there's some great stories in there. And of course, the Heatwave Festival, 1980, the first, last, and only punk rock festival or new wave festival. Atmosport, again, just one day, headlined by Elvis Costello, his only North American date that year. The Rumor Rockpile, the Pretenders, Talking Heads, the B-52s, Canada's Teenage Head, Canada's group, the Kings. I mean, another incredible one-day show. where
Right.
Talking Heads debuted their 9-piece band. I mean, these are some of that was the last show I ever did. It was such a great show. I decided, you know what? This is my swan song. I'm done. I'm not going to promote any shows. This was the last one. It's one of the great shows of all time.
Did you do anything with any of the other Beatles at any point?
I met George Harrison at Dave Mason's wedding. Other than that, no, I did not. Didn't meet Ringo and never met Paul.
So you never promoted any concerts with
No,
either of them?
no,
Okay.
no, no.
Okay. John, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you for doing this and taking the time and dropping all the story. They were great. And I want to recommend the movie to everybody. It's Revival 69. I got it right that time.
You got it right, fabulous.
I
Well,
got it
look,
right. I got it right.
it's always an honor for me to be interviewed and to be able to talk about these wonderful events and to share them with people that are contemporaneously looking at them as history for the most part, because I want people to know that there was a rich history back then, that there were young people that were like I would consider them like the techies, are putting on concerts was like a startup. Okay. And there were a
Right.
lot of people doing it. Some of us were fortunate enough to be able to be in an environment and city and have the financial wherewithal or opportunity to be able to do these bigger things. And I just want people to know that, a shout out to anybody in their 20s right now. That's an amazing time to live. And I just encourage them to be fearless, because that's what we had to be.
Okay. John, again, thank you. And hopefully this is not the last time you and I get
Wonderful.
together for an interview.
Next, we have Piers Hemmingsen, a renowned authority on Canada's history with the Beatles and the author of two great encyclopedic books called The Beatles in Canada Volumes 1 and 2. He'll discuss the latest developments on the Beatles' 1965 Toronto concert tapes he discovered that made the news last year, and why he now says that the sound, as good as it is even better than originally thought. And we'll discuss what Peter Jackson told crowds at the Fest for Beatle fans about the Beatles' Hamburg tapes, and what Piers' thoughts are on what may be in store for them, and much more. Here's my talk with Piers Hemmingsen.
We are underway. I'm talking with Piers Hemmingsen, who I can honestly say is the authority of the Beatles in Canada. Piers, it's nice to talk to you again. It has been a while since we have talked.
It has, but it seems like yesterday.
And he's the author of two books, The Beatles in Canada, Volume 1 and Volume 2. Based on what I've seen of Volume 1, it is an incredibly meticulously detailed look at the Beatles in Canada. And we'll talk about Volume 2 later on. But let me start. The reason I'm actually talking to you is because I recently talked to John Brower, who's the co-promoter of the 1969 Rock and Roll Revival Festival in Toronto, where John and Yoko and the Plastic Ono Band and old rock and rollers played. He told me that there had been some recent developments about the Beatles' 1965 Toronto concert tape that you have, and that you recently met again with Karen Bliss, the author of the Billboard piece about the tapes, which the Toronto Star reported had been heard by Apple in 2015 and rejected. But now you have discovered that they're even in better quality than originally reported. Talk about, first of all, how good they are. I mean, if I compare them to, say, the Hollywood Bowl tapes, are they better than the Hollywood Bowl tapes?
Well, that's a big question. I'll just I'll just step back a bit.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so back to Apple, and you'd said they rejected the tapes. Well, they never really rejected the tapes. They just, at the time, they were kind enough to bring me over to Abbey Road Studios, and I sat there with Giles Martin and, of course, Jonathan Clyde of Apple, and they had an engineer, and we played, the Beatles set, but it wasn't really what they were after. So what they were looking for at that time was material for the Ron Howard movie 8 Days a Week. Of course, if you looked at what happened there, they actually put the Shea Stadium film out with that film, which was awesome. I loved it.
So did I. I did too.
but the set is exactly the same pretty much as what was done at Shea Stadium just like 48 hours before the first Toronto show. So the answer to your question, is it better Hollywood Bowl or Shea Stadium? I would probably say it's different. The quality is, what we heard at Apple or at Abbey Road was played on a quarter track system, and it was through John Brower last summer that he was able to connect me with a very, very qualified studio engineer here in Toronto, who just so happened to have access to an Ampex, a large half track tape player, that is similar to the one that was, the format that was used at Hollywood Bowl and at Shea Stadium. So half track, I don't know enough about the technical aspect of things, but there, John Brower and I sat inside the Live Wire studio in Toronto with engineer Doug McClement. And incidentally, Doug McClement, I'm laughing because Doug McClement was actually at the Rock and Roll Revival as well in 1969. So everything kind of fits together here with this story. So we listened to it on the quarter track format, and then Doug said, "I've got an idea. Let me try it on half track." So John and I had just sat there and listened to the whole thing on quarter track, and then we thought we were going home. And Doug said, "Let's give this a listen," and it was like our jaws dropped. So it was, now you could hear Ringo's cymbals, you could hear things on stage that we didn't hear before. So the really good thing about it is that Doug had access to Maple Leaf Gardens archival information, had access to a film of their recording equipment, and there was an Tech 6-channel mixer and an Ampex half-track recorder, and he compared it to the equipment that was used at Shea Stadium, and it was very similar. Of course, Shea Stadium probably had more of it, but I think listening to it again was really something when it was played on the higher density format. And then John Brower also has a good friend named Bob Ezrin. That name may be familiar to you. He was from Toronto. He was involved with The Wall by the Pink Floyd and other, Alice Cooper at his start of his career. So Bob was invited to listen in as well, and Bob was really impressed with the recording, and we quoted Bob in one of the articles. Bob said, it's like being on stage with the Beatles. So you hear them working, you hear the banter between Beatle banter. And I remember listening to Ringo and I Want to Be Your Man, and hearing Ringo being so thankful to the audience after he finished the song. And then, the cherry on top was Lennon thanking Ringo for doing such a great job. So they were a working band in 1965. They were just, they were probably still on a high from Shea Stadium. They'd never played to, you go back to Hamburg, they weren't playing to, however many thousands of people that they played at Shea Stadium. So it must have been a real high for them. So I think overall, I'd say that the recording starts off a little bit shaky because maybe there was so much screaming and the people that were running the equipment up above probably were focused on the Beatles and weren't focused on the actual meters. But after, I think, the second song, things really improve. They really do. They sound so much more balanced. And I think on the first song, Paul's vocal is kind of missing from the microphone. They fix that by the second song. So it's not perfect all the way through, but I'd say from the third song onward, it's excellent. And the crowd's out there, but they're not dominating what you're hearing. So I would say I don't have access to the master tapes for Shea Stadium or Hollywood Bowl. I always found Hollywood Bowl was great, but there's a lot of trebly crowd noise, and I don't really get on this recording. But that's just my ears.
Did Apple hear, or did Apple play it in 4-track, or did they play it at the lower quality? In other words, did they hear the same quality that you heard the second time?
No, No.
They did.
So when I got there, I didn't know enough about recording quality. I didn't even know how this thing had been recorded in the first place. It took me about a year to get my own, Sony tape deck after I acquired these tapes. And, for background, I didn't even know what was on them when I bought them. They were just marked Beatles. I assumed it was 1964, but when I played the tapes, it was about a year after I got them. I realized it was 1965, not 1964. So
Oh my gosh.
when I went to Abbey Road in July of 2015, they assumed what I assumed. So, they had a Sony consumer type tape player that was brought in by Lester Smith, who was a long time Abbey Road engineer. And, it was really, they were really interested in whether there was anything they could use for their film. So I don't know if they were really looking at overall quality at that time, but like I said, they didn't reject them.
They just
They just
passed
said,
over 'em.
yeah, Jeff Jones very kindly just said, look, not at this time, but maybe sometime later. So here we are now. Good God, it's almost 10 years later. So when we heard this revelation, if you will, in 2024, and that, this was like a a bolt of lightning for me. It's like how these tapes were filed away in a drawer after that 2015 visit, and
Mhm.
I didn't think much about it until I was at the Fest in Chicago last summer, and they had a Zoom call with Peter Jackson and Michael Lindsay Hogg, and they were talking about the Star Club tapes and what Peter was doing with them, where he mentioned that his software, he calls it MAL, I believe, that it worked with original tapes. It was it was an evolving type of software, and it was promising, but the Star Club tapes weren't quite ready yet. But stay tuned. That was the message I got, and I said to myself, hey, wait a minute, I've still got those original tapes, and after 10 years, nobody else has come up with another set. So I'm assuming these are them. These are the only ones. So
Mhm.
you have, like Hollywood Bowl, you have Shea Stadium. And because Brian Epstein came to Toronto after the Shea concert, I sort of thought, well, maybe they just decided they would tape it as a backup for the film that they had made at Shea Stadium, maybe thinking that maybe the sound wouldn't have been any good, or to have a second set of tapes might have been a good idea just to have for, the film.
Mhm. Has Apple come back and shown any interest, any new interest yet, or is it too soon to to ask that question?
Well, I mean, I keep Apple in the loop all the time, so
Okay.
they know about the new format, and I have provided them a sample that they can compare. And so, working with Apple is they're a great organization, but this is, I guess, in one sense, there's nothing new in terms of songs, but it's the fact that it was recorded in this. I mean, there were
Format.
nine concerts in Canada between 64 and 66. This was the only one that was recorded on a half track, professionally recorded. And of course, the tapes have survived. So my initial worry, Steve, was that these tapes, after 10 years, might have been in bad shape. But again, we got very lucky that there is one little splice that was done at Abbey Road, but that can be easily fixed. I mean, it's
Hmm.
just it's a very short, like 1 second drop.
It was
Uh,
a splice down at Abbey Road. What was
well,
that?
when I guess when over time before I got the tapes, somebody had twisted over one piece of tape, so it had to be spliced. That's
Oh,
just
I see.
I kept the little piece of tape they took out, of course,
Hmm.
but yeah, it's a drop that we were able to fix even here in Toronto. So I think that's, I mean, if everything in life was perfect, that would be great. But there's always some little thing. But I
Yeah.
think it's the least to worry about. Honestly, you wouldn't even know. I've heard the patch. You wouldn't even know.
You suggested in one interview, I think with the Toronto Star, that the concert might have been recorded without Brian Epstein's knowledge. Do you still agree with, you still hold to that? Do you think Brian knew
Um,
about the recording?
well, I've asked somebody who's far more knowledgeable
Hmm,
than I am over in the UK, and you can guess who that is.
mhm.
He didn't think that there was any documentation about it, and he of all people would be the person I would consult.
Right.
First name is Mark, and
Yes.
so you can theorize that if he didn't know, why would somebody buy and do something that was totally illegal and go to all that expense? They had, the same system in the press conference. So there's two tapes here. One is the extended press conference in Toronto on that day. There's also all of the opening acts, the MC, Sounds Incorporated, Brenda Holloway, King Curtis with Cornell Dupree, all of that. I mean, there's 39 songs, Steve. You're
Wow.
you're getting the entire concert, the whole afternoon.
You
And
were
of
trying,
course,
go ahead.
sorry. Yeah, I
I,
mean, they were late coming back from Shea Stadium. There was a problem with their chartered plane. So the afternoon concert, as far as I remember, what I was writing about was the afternoon show didn't start till about 10 to 7 in
hmm.
the evening. So they basically did two concerts in one evening, and it was still very hot inside Maple Leaf Gardens. So lots of interesting things happened that day, but there the tapes record everything.
Hmm. Wow, that's fantastic. You were trying to sell those tapes. Did you sell them?
No, we just, in one of the articles we talked about the fact that we're looking to raise funds to get not only the new book printed, you know,
You're
uh,
talking about Beatles in Canada, Volume Two?
volume two. Yeah, volume two is done, and we want to print it, but we also have a huge number of people that would like volume one as well. So
Hmm.
there's quite a, things moved on after the pandemic. Printing companies that did this kind of work upgraded their facilities. They no longer print in black and white. They print every page in color, even if it's just black and white. So it's an expensive undertaking if we do it the right way. So that's what our plan is, to raise funds and deploy those funds to get all of these books out, printed and out there
Have
distributed. So
Have you got a GoFundMe or anything like that in the works now, or?
we are looking at that,
Hmm.
and things take time, but that's it. Everything's one step ahead, and 1 week to the next. We're getting closer.
You also curated an exhibit in Toronto that closed in January called "From Me to You: The Beatles in Canada, 1964 to 66." What were some of the things that were in the exhibit?
Okay, so that's actually, they extended that. It's running until the end of May
Oh,
at the
good.
National Music Center. People can still go there. And that came through a wonderful guy named Bob Santelli, who does work for, I think now for Bruce Springsteen, his archive, and had worked for Rolling Stone and also the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Hmm.
And I was recommended to Bob, and Bob had, I guess, a touring exhibit in the States called Ladies and Gentlemen, the Beatles, or I can't remember what it was called, but it was touring for a long time. Anyway, they were interested in Canadianizing some of that. So what's in the exhibit? We cover basically what's in the Red Book, which is how did rock and roll arrive in Canada? Of course, it came through the airwaves from the USA. And how did the Beatles music arrive in Canada before, if you will, it arrived in the USA? So some of those early copies, Parlophone records that were sent to Canada in 62, copies of Love Me Do were sent to Ray Sonnen at CFRB in Toronto. We have that record in there. Dino Corey in Winnipeg at the radio station there, he got a copy. And the third one, which I always like best, was sent by George's mother to George's older sister Louise, who
Oh,
was living here in Canada at the end of 62. She had moved to Canada in 56, and then she moved to Benton, Illinois, I think in early 63, but
Right.
she actually received her copy of Love Me Do while she lived in Beck. It was a Christmas gift, Christmas 62. So
Hmm.
all of these stories are there. Plus, then we move into how did Capitol Records, a guy named Paul White, he gave Love Me Do a chance. So he actually signed the Beatles to Capitol in early 63, while Dave Dexter down in Los Angeles chose not to issue the first 4 Beatles singles on Capitol. I don't know if Dave Dexter was wrong or not, because maybe they wouldn't have been bought anyway. They didn't sell many copies up here in 63. So we go through that whole thing. And then we of course get to Beatlemania. Beatlemania really hits Canada in late 63 into early 64. There was, I guess, a couple of people I worked with from the States, great people, Bruce Spicer and Jeff Augsburger. They donated some really, really cool items from their collections. There's a Eaton's department store Beetle bar exhibit that they had Beetle bars in the summer of 64, like every kind of Beetle item you thought of. And then right next to that was a Beetle fan's bedroom. So, they went shopping at the Beetle bar, then they brought the stuff home. They had wallpaper, they had everything you could think of. And Bruce generously donated his Canadian Butcher album. I mean, there's not many of those out there, I'll tell you. Capitol made sure they were all destroyed, whereas we didn't have any paste overs up here in Canada, but there was 1 or 2 that escaped the destruction order. And then we get all of the concerts, of course, 64, and then 65, 66. And it's funny, at the time that we were working on the exhibit, that was my first interview with Karen Bliss was while I was out there opening the exhibit, and I casually mentioned, she asked me about recordings. I said, well, there are recordings of some concerts, and I mentioned the one from 1965. So that sort of began the journey of the tapes, that reviving interest in the tapes started really in July, and then carried on from there.
You mentioned Eaton. John Brower mentioned that to me when I talked to him, and it should be noted again that Eaton's was a big company in Canada. They were, I guess, he said they were kind of the biggest retailer in Canada. Is that, am I inaccurate about that?
No, you're 100%. They're like, they used to be like Macy's or AC Penny, like they were right across the country, large department stores with record bars. They sold everything, clothing, furniture, appliances, all of it. And the 2 Eaton brothers that financed, if you will, the rock and roll revival. John Brower worked with Thor Eaton, and they were about to pull their money out of the rock and roll revival, and then some bright guy from California named Kim Foley, he suggested that Brower contact John Lennon, because
Right,
all of Lennon's heroes were going to be playing in one day, in one afternoon, evening.
right, right.
Yeah, so yeah, it's all connected.
It's all connected.
Mhm.
Since we're talking about John Brower and the festival, you sourced some of the tapes that were used in the movie. I guess the interviews, or the audio, vintage audio in that movie.
Yeah,
Is that
yeah. The phone call from Toronto to London, but you only hear the London end of it. You only hear the John Lennon Yoko conversation. You don't hear Brower on the other side of the
Mhm.
Atlantic, but you hear the questions that are being asked, and it really is quite fascinating. That recording, of course, we didn't have any video Zoom call in those days, so it's just audio. And the producer director of the film, Ron Chapman, he very cleverly made it that sequence of the Revival 69 film, and I think it worked out okay.
I was very impressed with the audio, how the audio fitted in there. I mean, that really added to the story. And as I told John, I really wasn't expecting much more than just a rehash of the festival, and the movie is a lot more than that.
It
I,
is.
it really,
It
I mean, it was really a surprise to me how good it was. It really was great.
it's
Um,
funny. I've been working with John Brower for many years,
Mm-hmm.
before I actually surprised him one day. We were having breakfast in Toronto, and we were meeting at a restaurant. I brought my laptop, and I had my Sony headphones that I'm wearing right now. And I said, John, you got to listen to this. And I for years I'd heard him describe what happened that day, but
Mm-hmm.
his version of the phone call didn't quite match up with what was actually on there. So it's funny how your memory, plays certain tricks on you. I mean, his memory is excellent, by the way.
It
And
is.
but to see his face when he was listening to the Lennon, Yoko, and the other side of the conversation, it really was a memory I'm never going to forget.
Well, he told me all sorts of great stories that are in the interview that's in this
Mm-hmm.
podcast, and he talked about Jim Morrison. He talked about the motorcycle
Oh yeah,
escorting John and Yoko into the
yep.
city. I mean, there were just so many great. He told me a great story about Little Richard. You know that
Mm,
story where Little Richard said, "I'm going to close the show, Mister Promoter, Mister Doors, Mister Lennon."
yeah.
And he was very forceful about that, and I thought that was very amusing.
Well, what a show that was. I mean, all those legends on one stage,
Right,
and of course, adding in the Doors and Alice Cooper, and of course the Plastic Ono Band. I've had the good fortune to over the years meet Eric Clapton, Alan White, and Klaus Voormann. I never got to meet, of course, John Lennon, but boy, all those guys, a leap of faith, flying over to Toronto, rehearsing
right.
on a plane, and nobody really knew for sure if they would turn up. It was all just sort of a little bit of, as you say, promotion, promoting how to get a stadium filled with people when tickets haven't sold and you're about to lose your shirt.
Well, and the interesting thing about that festival is that there was okay, he took a chance on getting John as it was, and then he almost didn't get him. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
he had to reach back and do a little bit of magic, I suppose that you could call it, and he got him, and it was amazing that he was able to get him. So yeah,
It's
that was a great part of the story.
there was the fortuitous part, I think, that really isn't part of the film so much, was that Rich York happened to be at,
Hmm.
at Apple, to interview George Harrison. He'd already booked that interview, and he was he was sort of drawn into that room while John was on the other end, and he could vouch for John Brower. So having somebody there from Canada who could vouch for, this was a real offer. This wasn't just somebody, cooking something up. This
Right,
was happening.
right. Yeah, that is in the movie
Mm-hmm.
about Richie York, and it's great. So let me ask you about the Hamburg tapes. I don't know if there's really. You said you saw Peter Jackson talking about this at the Fest for Beatle fans.
Yeah.
Um,
So
talk
what
about exactly what's going on there, and is there has anything moved on this? Is this for real that they're working on this?
Well, what he told the crowd, in the room, was that he purchased the original tapes from the estate, I guess, of King Size Taylor, I'm guessing, or whoever owned them,
Hmm.
and that he was working on them. And I think these are, you will know, these are from Star Club, but when they had Ringo, right? It was December of '62.
Hmm.
They were issued as a double album back in the '70s, but the I bought that thing and the quality wasn't very good. So I think the thinking is that his software will do something amazing with those tapes,
Right,
so that they're more listenable. I think the problem for a lot of younger Beatle fans is that the quality of some of the early stuff isn't very, they're used to hearing stuff on a download or a stream, and it isn't. I mean, it's tough to listen to,
right.
and so I think that would be the ultimate. Just like he did for the Get Back project, the film. I mean, what a refreshing thing, and I think that's what. I followed Peter Jackson with his World War One film and what he did with that. He is amazing. So
Hmm.
how that comes out, we don't know. I mean, I haven't heard anything since then. So all I can think of is what he said was that, it's promising and it's not there yet, but they're going to get there. So he doesn't seem like a guy who's going to give up on something like that.
You've probably heard some of the many versions of that thing that have been floated out there by different fan projects. Some of them sound fairly decent, but none of
Mm-hmm.
them. But when you compare to what he did with Now and Then, they're not even
Mm-hmm.
close to that. And
No.
if Peter Jackson is able to do with those Hamburg tapes something close to what he did to Now and Then, it'll be amazing. It'll be incredible because the performances on those tapes are amazing. They're stunning. They
Yeah.
are so good on the, I and they really are. I mean, do you agree that they are phenomenal on those tapes?
Oh, absolutely. Now, here's what a lot of people are talking about. I was in the UK in January,
Hmm.
and 2025 is the 30th anniversary of Anthology.
Right.
So the rumor, I don't want to spread rumors, but the rumor that I've heard is that they are working on an updated anthology. So it is possible that some of these Hamburg era recordings might form part of an upgraded. I'm guessing, this would be another Disney Plus release, just like
Yes.
Beatles 64 and Get
Right.
Back and Let It Be. And then, I don't think, I don't think the world is the same as it was in 1995, where we all wanted the vinyl and the CD and the VHS tapes and the CD or the DVDs. This will be about having something on a Disney Plus visual,
Mm.
platform. I guess they'll sell stuff too, but that's what I think is going to happen. I could be way off base, but they can't just reissue something like this when 30 years have passed and they have all this new technology and they have all this other material that they could throw into the mix.
Right. Right. There is if on Facebook, I'm seeing it all the time that people do want physical stuff. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, you're right. I'm sure that Disney Plus will have the first crack at the
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, we'll see where that goes. I hope
I
that
I'm also, I was living in the UK when they were doing all this stuff in the early 90s and mid 90s, and I was a huge fan of the first Live at the BBC, and I thought
Mhm.
that is the quality of that was great, and maybe they can even, who knows what they're going to do with all this stuff. There's so much they can do.
Right. Mm. You mentioned earlier, and I just want you to give everybody the word about the volume two of. Actually, you do it about both books because you said both books are going to be available again, correct?
That's the plan, and spoiler alert: volume one will be basically version two of volume one. So corrections, new information. That is the plan for that. Not huge changes, of course, but important changes.
Right.
And then the blue book, as I call it, picks up where the red book leaves off. The red book ends just as the first tour of Canada, part of that summer North American tour, is ending. So it goes Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, and then that is kind of the end of the period covered in the red book. And now the blue book covers basically summer 64 all the way up and until 1970. We go up and until the Long and Winding Road, and of course the Peace Festival that John Brower attempted to put together,
Right.
and John and Yoko eventually, withdrew their support from the project for a number of reasons. But some of those, all the stuff, the Toronto concert 65, 66, stuff that happened at Expo 67, where they premiered Sergeant Pepper, all the way through all the interviews, television, radio, the Canadian recordings, and then of course we have the three trips in 69, John and Yoko doing the bed in Montreal, the rock and roll revival, and then the third trip for the War is Over launch and the meeting with Canada's Prime Minister at the time. And then the Peace Festival that really was going to be like Woodstock 2, but of course it didn't. They were talking about having Elvis Presley, the Beatles, all of that stuff. It was a tall order, but God bless John, because he didn't give up. He put on a festival in the summer of 1970 at Mossport, same place that he had originally planned to have it. And of course, John and Yoko weren't there, but he did rename the festival to the Strawberry Fields Festival. So there was a kind of a nod to the fact that they had been involved at one time, and they weren't.
You didn't go to the revival, did you?
No, I was about 5 hours up the road. If I'd known about it back then, you had to read about it the next day in a newspaper. We didn't have the internet, so I would have been on the first bus from Ottawa to Toronto. But I think it's lovely to know that not only did his phone call, and the urging of Kim Foley result in the Plastic Ono Band coming to Toronto, but it also resulted in an album. One of the albums that was recorded while John was still a Beatle, and it's side one and side two are two different things, but having the movie, having the album, and having history documented in book form like we're going to have, I think it's I've been so lucky. Paul White, who I mentioned earlier, he helped not only with the Red Book, but he was still around. He lived until 2018 and basically gave me everything he had until Let It Be. So nothing is missed. I say, these things are detailed. They're not for the average person. I think this is more for posterity, but to know exactly what happened in Canada, how the Beatles story in Canada was part of the whole Beatles story worldwide. I think it's there's so many great books, whether they're from Sweden or Japan or of course the United States. The Beatles were a global phenomenon. And, it's nice to be able to the reason I write books is so that I forget everything. I can go back to the book and remember. So you cannot possibly remember everything. It's impossible. But to have John Brower, I've known him for many, many years, and he's an absolute champion supporter. And I've had a forward from, Richie York, God bless him, who agreed to do the forward before he passed away, and he dutifully sent it to me, and that's part of the book. John Brower has a forward, and we also have a forward from a gentleman named Sandy Gardner. You probably don't know that name, but if you had a copy of the Canadian Beatlemania album, he has a quote on the very front cover. He called Beatlemania a disease, and Sandy was actually the first journalist. He immigrated to Canada from Scotland, and he wrote a review of Love Me Do that appeared in the Ottawa Journal in early March of 1963. So I expect that he was probably the first journalist in North America to write a review of a Beatle record. So he's written a forward as well. So we between volume 1 and volume 2, it's the whole shebang, so to speak.
So what's the timeline as far as raising money and the book coming out so that people get an idea of what they can look forward to or look ahead to?
Well, if it was up to me, it would be like tomorrow, but things don't happen that quickly. So I think John Brower is a promoter. He's been very, very instrumental in getting me this far, and I think we're going to finish it off very soon. And stay tuned.
Okay, you don't want to give me you don't have a publication date for the new books yet, or no?
I don't want to give that away just yet.
Okay.
I think that's
But you have something firmed up though, is what you're saying, is what I'm getting, is that you know where you're headed, in other words, right?
Absolutely. But I was at the fest in 2019 saying the book would be out, soon. And here I am in 2025. So I don't, I know somebody else who's in the same predicament. You have to have it just right. It has to be what it's supposed to be. And I know when I did the Red Book, that took a number of years, and it was late, and we got there in the end, and people were happy with it. So I I have a I have a hope that people will be more than happy with volume two.
Okay. All right. Well, Piers, best of luck with the
Thank you,
books,
Steve.
and thank you for going through all that information. That was tremendous. That was, and
Yeah.
combined with you and John, we've got kind of
Mm,
like an encyclopedia of the show here on the
yeah.
Beatles in Canada, and it's great. And anytime, if there's any more developments on anything, feel free to. I would love to have you come back and talk about it.
Well, yeah. Well, God willing, we'll be doing this in 2035.
If we can do this again, if there's more to be, to be heard, if the story advances and we have something to talk about, I would love to have you come back. So good luck in your
I
research and with
thank
the
you.
with the tape.
Yeah,
I hope
thank you.
and I hope we get to hear that tape soon. You
Well, that
know.
was going to be my parting shot for you. Is that the I'm just a custodian. These tapes have to be heard by Beatles fans, and I have a feeling that they'll be part of what people are going to listen to for many years from now. So there
Okay.
we have it.
There we have it. Thank you again, Piers.
Okay, Steve, you take care.
You too.
And here's a few reviews for you all. First of all, CBS's Ringo and Friends at the Ryman Special was a delightful tribute to the Americana music that Ringo has always loved. The show was a love fest of the Beatles by the guest artists and a great trip back into history for Ringo, both personally playing on the Ryman stage and singing the Beatles songs that shows how much he loves country music. Ringo also talked about how country music affected him with some delightful and anecdote-filled interviews and showcased his new album, Look Up. There's a great joy that's all over this special, and even Paul McCartney gets into the act by making a cameo appearance. For me, though, Molly Tuttle is the second star of the show. Her voice has such a vibrancy to every song she performs. I especially like the version in the special of I Don't Want to Spoil the Party she did with Sheryl Crow. If you missed the show, it's now streaming on Paramount Plus and without commercials. As far as Look Up goes, the album takes some listening, but it's worth the time. Ringo has never sounded more comfortable in his solo years. The Molly Tuttle songs, there's that name again, are my favorites, especially Can You Hear Me Call? She's really a treasure. Ringo is having a great time and it's very evident. I think this one will be around for a while. And then there's George Harrison's reissue of Living in the Material World. It has a new mix by Paul Hicks. Didn't mean that for that to rhyme, but anyway. And a second disc of album outtakes if you buy the 2-disc version. But the streaming versions have George singing Sunshine Life for Me, which Ringo also recorded, and the deluxe version also has an instrumental version of that song. Both of these should have been available with the 2-disc version. Fans shouldn't have to pay big bucks for those two songs. But the album itself sounds great, and the outtakes, as few as there are wonderful. Too bad there's not more. We saw Peter Asher performing locally over the weekend, and as usual, it was a delightful show, with Peter running through the Peter and Gordon hits and talking about his celebrated career producing albums for artists including James Taylor and Linda Ronstadt, his Grammy Awards, and also being given the royal honor as Commander of the British Empire in 2015. For those who have seen the show before, this edition has a new section with a clip from the Beatles' Get Back film, where Paul McCartney mentions Peter and Gordon. All in all, it was a great evening and well worth catching if it comes to your town. And that's all we have for now. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe where you get your podcasts from, or for more of our thought-provoking, must-hear Beatles talk. And if you would, we would really appreciate if you'd leave us a review, hopefully a good one, because Google loves good reviews and subscriptions. Until next time, this is Steve Marinucci saying,
Be seeing you.
Wonderful show! Wonderful show! Oh, wonderful, wonderful.
Keep that one. Mark it fab.